Okay.
Hello and welcome. I'm
Hello.
Aver Salar, a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute. Is my voice going on here?
Yes, I hear you. I hear you.
Yeah, sorry. I welcome all of you for this panel, which is the second of the panels that we will have on Russia and Iran. And I'm pleased to join with a very distinguished panelist today to discuss some topics which are evolving actually on Iran and Russia topics. Well, many believe that the war in Ukraine is creating a new space for cooperation between Iran and Russia. Yesterday, just Ibrahim Raisi and Vladimir Putin met in Turkmenistan in sidelines of the Caspian Sea Forum, and they are discussing building new cooperations along their joint interests. The range of cooperations that these days are available on the tables of Iranian and Russian leaders seems to be vast, from countering US and international sanctions on collaborating to build and link their financial systems together, and at the same time to create a sort of alliance to build a non-Western order. And of course, in the context of their anti-Americanism, vast areas of cooperation can be found. But at the same time, there is a counter-argument going on, which is about the creations or the emergence of strategic vacuums and the conflicts of interest. Strategic vacuums such as in Syria, which many analysts have assessed, and we will discuss today in depth on that, and also conflict of interest such as in energy sector. So the key question is that which of these two arguments will prevail? Will Russia and Iran be able to create a new era of cooperation based on their joint actually views toward the international relation and the joint problems, which is the international isolation that they are facing? Or these conflicts of interest and strategic vacuums will limit and constrain their cooperations? These are vast areas and of course complex questions that I'm pleased to discuss them today with a very, very interesting and knowledgeable panelists, which I will try to briefly introduce them. First, we have Jakub Godzimirski, who is a professor at Norwegian Institute for International Affairs. Then we have Diana Galeva, who is the visiting fellow at Oxford University. And last, but certainly not the least, we have Hamid Reza Azizi, who is a fellow at SWP in Berlin. I'm thankful to all of them for accepting my invitation and joining to today's meeting. Just a few points before we start the panel. Please take your time and write the questions that you may face during the panel. I try to do my best to bring as much as possible questions into the discussion. You can use the function of the Zoom in bottom of your screens to drop your question. But if you're watching us on the live stream or you're using your phone, please drop your questions to events@mei.edu, or if you face with any technical issues, use the same email, events@mei.edu. So with no further ado, I would like to start the panel with you, Jakub. We are hearing that Russia these days is exporting a lot of oil to China, while at the same time, China was a key buyer of Iranian oil. Do you see a sort of conflict of interest here emerging? This is at the time that both sides are saying that they're thinking about energy swap or new projects on the energy cooperation. So how is the situation at the end of the day, Jakub? Please, floor is yours.
Well, it's a very important and highly relevant question, because we have to do with two countries that face a number of sanctions being imposed against them. Also, those two countries' energy sectors are somehow hit by those sanctions, and we have also to do with a country that is still one of the leading importers and consumers of energy, that is also to a large extent interested in achieving the same goals as both Iran and Russia. So we have a kind of a triangle of sometimes mutually overlapping, sometimes mutually conflicting interests. And I don't see an immediate tension raising in energy relations between Iran and Russia in respect to oil supplies to China. The Chinese market seems to be almost insatiable, meaning that it will most probably consume all the volumes of energy that are going to be supplied there. So there is no space and no need for those two countries to compete on the Chinese market. On the other hand, China is very skillful at using all the opportunities that emerge due to some international developments. And we know that both Russia and Iran are selling their oil under the market price to Chinese companies. And this also has some implications for not only Iran and Russia, but also for China, because China is somehow being quite often accused of undermining the sanctions regimes by allowing both Iranian and Russian oil to be supplied to this market. So my short answer to this question is not, there is not going to be a huge conflict of interest. There will be some maybe tension, some competition for access to the Chinese market, but it's not going to develop into a kind of huge competition and rivalry neither on the Chinese market. The situation could look like slightly differently on the European market, but this is another question.
Yeah, just very short afterward of this initial question, Jacob, back to you again. That what are the projects that they are discussing to cooperate? I mean, how the prospects of energy cooperation between Russia and Iran could look like?
They too belong to the group of countries that are among major producers and exporters of energy, but there are also huge differences between them. We know that Russia sits on the biggest reserves of natural gas. Iran is also a huge gas producer, but on the other hand, Russia needs to export 1/3 of its gas production to other markets, while Iran uses its gas mostly to cover its own energy needs. So there is a certain level of complementarity between those two countries, and also areas where they could compete for access to various markets, for market shares. But the situation is rather unpredictable for the time being. We don't know what impact those sanctions are going to have, and we also see that there are new types of sanctions being imposed also on Iranian oil. On the 25th of May, American authorities imposed some sanctions on this, what they mean as kind of illegal networks that facilitate the supply of Iranian oil to China. This may open some opportunities for Russian oil. There have been some reports that some of the refineries in China seem to prefer to buy Russian oil because it's not it does not expose them to retaliatory measures from the American side. So those types of questions need to be well understood, but we have to do with the situation developing rapidly, and we don't know what the end station of the situation is going to be.
Thank you so much, Jacob. I would like to now turn to Hamid Reza. This concept of power vacuum that many these days are talking that might emerge in Syria, because of one of the consequences of Russian problems in the Ukrainian front, that they may not be able to devote enough resources, the military side, to Syria. So my first question is that, do you think that is really something which is taking place on the ground, or it's more at the level of speculations? And if depending on your answer, then how is you assess the Iranian response to that? I mean, are Iranians seeing that as an opportunity that probably can be used and could advance their presence in Syria? Please, Hamid Reza.
Yeah, thank you very much. Many thanks to you, Farzam, and the Middle East Institute for organizing this panel. This is a very valid question, I think, because since the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we've seen a lot of different reports about, for example, Russia mobilizing its, mercenaries in Syria to send them to Ukraine, or withdrawing forces from Syria. But in order to better answer this question, and also its relevance to the issue of Iran-Russia relations in Syria, I think we need to provide a very brief background. Of course, Russia's failure to achieve its main strategic objectives in Ukraine, at least as quickly as expected, it has already affected some elements of Russia's policy in Syria. Since 2015, since the start of Russian involvement in the Syrian crisis, Russia has always used, or at least tried to use, its influence in Syria as a kind of instrument for diplomatic maneuvering in the Middle East and also beyond, especially in terms of, emphasizing its international status as a great power equal to the United States. Now the situation is like, when we discuss the impacts of the war in Ukraine, on Russia's position in Syria, we need to take this very important element into account, because now on the one hand, of course, Russia, as I said, has not been successful in going ahead as planned, at least in the first phases of its operation or military invasion in Syria. But on the other hand, losing Syria as the main symbol of post-Soviet restoration of Russian military power, or at least what we've seen so far, that would, further complicate Russia's situation and its, especially its international standing. So in that sense, I would say the Russian leaders are facing a kind of dilemma. On the one hand, of course, they need the maximum mobilization of forces, military forces, to kind of implement their plans in Ukraine. On the other hand, any kind of significant troop withdrawal from Syria could basically jeopardize Russia's achievements in Syria. So from this perspective, those reports about Russian troops withdrawing from some of their positions in Syria, especially in central Syria and somehow in the east, in Deir ez-Zor, in west of the Euphrates, and handing them over to the Iranian and Iran-backed forces. Those reports can make sense in that perspective. So I would see it, to put it briefly, I would see it not as a kind of competition in which Iran is taking advantage of Russia's involvement in Ukraine to expand its reach throughout Syria, but as a kind of coordination, basically, although tacit, between Iran and Russia, in which the Russians are kind of withdrawing from some not very important positions in Syria and giving access to Iran, because there's a variety of reasons I can explain further, maybe down the road. But then now what we can see is that that kind of competition that we used to see in areas like Deir ez-Zor, like some parts of central Syria, even at some point in Palmyra, in other places, it has now kind of been replaced by a kind of more coordination between two sides. Of course, at the political level, Iran has tried to take advantage of the situation. A few days after the start of the Russian invasion, Assad's security advisor, Ali Mamluk, came to Tehran, then Amir Abdullahian went to Russia, then Assad came to Tehran. So Iran, of course, tries to expand its political influence, and also this means that Iran, at the geographical, taking into consideration the geography of Syria, Iran's influence would also rise. But then, as I said, that doesn't mean that a kind of enhanced competition, at least between the sides.
Thank you so much, Hamid Reza. Very elaborative, actually. Now I would like to turn to Diana, a very important aspect of Russia-Iran relation, but I think less studied, is about their shared, or let's say not shared, identity, or to put it in general, identity politics in their relation. Well, Diana, you have worked on that a lot, and I just wonder how you think about having a kind of a shared possibility between two states which are substantially different. Iran is a Shiite theocratic state, and Russia is a Christian oligarchic state. How in the identity dimension they are coming together, and what narratives is linking them together, or maybe you argue differently. That's not the case at all.
Thank you so much, Farzam, and for your kind invitation to participate in this very important project. And also, it's a great honor for me to be in company of such leading expert on the subject. The Ukraine war has further revealed the complex relations between Iran and Russia, as you mentioned in your introduction. But at the same time, these shared identities between these two states, I believe, play a very important role for further collaborations. And I would put them at two different levels. First one, it's at the global level, more, let's put in a way, anti-Western agenda. And the second one, it's a shared Muslim identities, actually, as Russia is home for 20 million Muslims. And I will elaborate it further. So with regards to the first one, both states follow a broadly anti-Western agenda and pursue policies designed to redirect the liberal world order. Before the Ukraine conflict, I mean, there were very good academic works on the subject about the role of identities in both relations. But like, for example, some of them, the works, they stress that Iranian and Russian national identities don't prioritize either the liberal creed, human rights, or democracy. Both states, they continue to remain autocracies, which also helps to bring them together. Furthermore, among the important factors of liberalism are international organizations, which both states are often suspicious. Even during, for example, careful attempt to look towards the West, such as the first visit to Iran by a Polish foreign minister since 2014, President Raisi stated that Islamic Republic of Iran declares its strong opposition to NATO's expansionist policies. So this antipathy towards the strongest Western international security organization is, of course, shared with Moscow in general and in particular. Perhaps the most striking efforts to oppose the liberal world order, those linked with the breaking economic interdependence with the West. For example, during the visit by Russian Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak to Tehran in May, Russian and Iranian officials signed the three memorandums of understanding to increase collaboration in the fields of banking and energy. So they agreed to use their national currencies for energy and trade payments, and also the same discussions were during the meeting between Putin and Raisi. So this de-dollarization is a strategic move by Russia and China that has been ongoing since 2014, and it began when both Russia and China found what some experts have called a financial alliance, following Moscow's estrangement from the West over its annexation of Crimea. So overcoming the dollar in trade settlements become a necessity in trying to get around US sanctions. Already we can view the effect of collaborations between these two uniquely sanctioned states, as Sergei Lavrov just in his recent visit to Tehran stated that last year the trade turnover between Russia and Iran, despite Western sanctions, grew by more than 80% and exceeded $4 billion. So in other words, as one of the speakers in the latest, actually a panel on the project called them the world's most sanctioned states. So these realities pull them together to deal with the sanctions, boosting their relations. And this is agreement also to integrate the Shitap and Mir payment systems for agreement or barter trade. For example, Moscow will be able to import afterparts and gas turbines, and Iran in return steel. So all of these immediate benefits, this provides a challenge and provocation to the established financial system and strike against economic interdependence with the West. But at the same time, at the second level on the bilateral relations, I would like to argue that there is this the collaboration and the shared Muslim identities, as Russia is home for 20 or 25 million Muslims, and due to its geographic proximity and existence of Shia population in North Caucasus, especially in Dagestan. It's been very close Iranian influence in Dagestan, and I'm very happy to discuss it in Q&A broadly from my field work, share some stories as well. So and very interestingly also that the trade the meat mutton trade is also quite in high numbers between Iran and Dagestan. And also we see a lot of dynamics of Sunnis converting to Shiism in Dagestan. And for example, they largely came to Shiism through the pan-Islamic political organizations such as Hizb ut-Tahrir. So it's also very I found very interesting. But within the context of the ongoing also geopolitical competition between Russia and the West, in a way, there is also other dynamics like development of Islamic banking and finance, which may yet emerge as serious alternative to Western sanctions. But in this regard, I believe that Gulf states, GCC states are more, in a way, more practical alliances in this regard between Russia and the GCC to develop Islamic banking and finance. But there are some examples already that Russia and Iran and started to discuss this possibilities. Also, I'm happy to discuss in Q&A. So,
yeah, thank you so much, Liana. The last point you mentioned, GCC and Russia on the basis of their Islamic point, it's the next question I would like to ask you, because I think that's a interesting factor. I mean, also indirect impact on Iran. But before that, Jacob, I would like to return back to you on the energy issue. One more question. You know better than me that now here in Europe, the energy is the hot topic, and actually the war has changed Russian European energy policy and relation. How that is going to impact in a strategic way and in a long term Russia Gulf energy relations, if we want to see it in a broader picture beyond Iran and with the whole Persian Gulf region, how that is going to change by the war in Ukraine?
Well, this war in Ukraine is surely a kind of watershed event in energy relations between Russia and the European Union, or Europe in more general terms, and it has already had a huge impact on energy trade, and is going most probably to have even greater impact in years to come. But it's in a way something that is not completely new, because Russia has been preparing for this kind of European reluctance to buy fossil fuels, not only from Russia, but from all over the place, because European Union has embarked on this ambitious policy of cutting its energy footprint. One of the measures to be implemented is complete withdrawal or removal of fossil fuels from the European energy mix, and Russia has been told on several occasions that this is going to happen sometime in the future, but this war has to a very large extent speeded up this development. On the other hand, this war has also had a sort of interesting impact, because Germany is going to increase the share of coal in its energy mix in order to become less or completely independent of Russia's gas and oil supplies. Other countries may also use more coal, so this will also have some negative impact on the plan to cut all fossil fuels from the European energy mix. On the other hand, we need to understand that Russia has been preparing for this to come and has embarked on the policy of so-called market diversification, meaning that Russia has made several attempts and implemented some projects to make itself less dependent on access to the European market. But still, in 2019, that was somehow the last more or less normal year in energy terms, Russia still had a very strong connection to European Union. Between 70 and 80% of Russian piped gas exported from Russia reached the European Union. More than 55% of oil that Russia was exporting reached the European Union. Even LNG was mostly sent to the European Union. More than 52% of LNG sent from Russia to global markets reached the European Union, meaning that Russia was still very much dependent on having access to the European market. Although in 2019, for instance, this Power of Siberia gas pipeline was opened between Russia and China that is going to make China a more important market for Russian gas supplies. But those gas supplies are not coming from the same places where the gas is produced and exported to Europe. And this is a huge structural challenge Russia is facing, because Russia can ship its oil to all places in the world, especially if they somehow are willing to take a lower price than the market price. There will be plenty of customers, but the gas is something different, because Russia needs an infrastructure to be able to send the same volumes of gas as it used to send to Europe, and this infrastructure is not yet in place. So this is a huge challenge Russia is facing. But as I said in the beginning, this is not something that has come as a great surprise. Russia was aware of the fact that the European Union has this plan to get rid of this dependence on fossil fuels, but the war in Ukraine has definitely speeded up this process of withdrawing fossil fuels, especially fossil fuels originating in Russia, because other suppliers are welcome in Europe. Norway has plans to increase its production of gas. United States has said that they are going to supply Europe with more LNG. So it's mostly about Russian molecules, to put it that way.
Excellent, thank you. So interesting. Well, Hamid Reza, I would like to back to you on Syria, because we can discuss a lot on Syria and a lot of things happening there. On political side, you discussed very well in the military sphere how things are moving. But what about on politics? I mean, do you think that at some point Russia will start getting closer to the Arab countries of the Persian Gulf and to move into some sort of political settlement in Syria right now, that, or maybe in the near future, because of the implications of the war, as it sees itself in a more difficulty of sustaining the military power? So the long-term strategic goals, how might change because of the current situation?
Actually, when it comes to Russia's relations with Arab countries, we need to take into account that even before the war in Ukraine, Russia has had this policy of trying to maneuver between different actors in the Middle East, between Iran and the Arab countries. And the kind of partnership between Iran and Russia in Syria continued despite that kind of policy by Russia. So in that sense, and especially because, on the other hand, I think the Russians know this well, that what the, especially Arab states of the Persian Gulf are doing in terms of not taking any harsh position against Russia, but at the same time not supporting the Russian invasion of Ukraine, is a kind of hedging policy based, aimed at maximizing their individual interests. And that policy, of course, may change depending on the, points that those actors can get from the United States, from the West at some point. So looking from that perspective, I think the basic policy of maneuvering between Iran and the Arab countries will continue. But more specifically speaking about Syria, I don't think that something very substantial is going to happen in that front. The only thing that can happen actually would be not in the political sphere actually, but in the economic sphere, because what we saw in terms of Russian and Iranian plans for Syria's post-war reconstruction had been somehow, before the war. On the one hand, Russia was trying to get the most beneficial, to get contracts from the Syrian government on the most beneficial parts of the Syrian economy, from, for example, the energy and mine and phosphate mines, for example, etc. And on the other hand, Russia was apparently, counting on a kind of more active role being played by the Arab countries in terms of, coming in and reconstructing the Syrian economy. And all these were kind of against Iran's desire to have a more active role in the post-war economic reconstruction of Syria. So now I think that Russia's own economic capacity is under pressure because of the war in Ukraine. If and when the Arab states decides to come and get involved, it would be somehow less dependent on Russia's desire or Russia's longer-term plan. So it would be not necessarily kind of Russia-initiated or Russia-pushed thing, but a kind of more Arab-initiated decision to get involved in the Syrian reconstruction. So in that sense, looking at it from the perspective of Iran and Russia, it would be a kind of lose-lose game for both of them, a kind of more active role by the Arab countries. So in that sense, as I said, I don't see Russia's relations with Arab countries as, at least in the short to medium term, as being somehow kind of negative impact on Iran-Russia cooperation in Syria.
Yeah, but just very quick follow-up on your last point that you raised. Do you think that the Russia-Iran axis has the tools and the means capable to respond to this situation as a type of joint investment or whatever instruments of influence that they may have in Syria to prevent this scenario?
I think, economic partnership and political partnership, they have never been part of the agenda of Iran-Russia partnership. It's been basically a kind of, I would say, tactical. And so tactical also means temporary and also military partnership. So that's why I mentioned in response to your first question that we can see a kind of more active coordination again between Iran and Russia on the ground, but that's not going to necessarily, spill over to economic and political spheres. So that's very important to consider when kind of discussing Russia-Iran relations in Syria in general. So more coordination somehow, because, maybe it's good to also bear in mind that before the war in Ukraine, that kind of competition, because, the active military phase of the Syrian crisis had already ended. And for that reason, the differences and disagreements had already started to be translated into competition at the military level as well. As I mentioned, for example, in Deir ez-Zor, in central Syria, etc. So now it seems as if we have moved one step back, to the period that both Iran and Russia felt a kind of joint threat or challenge on the ground in Syria, because now also, we have there is the potential of more active American presence. We see the Turkish threat for another operation. We see the threat of the ISIS revival, and we see the Syrian opposition. Regardless of the ISIS and those more radical groups, also considering a kind of new push against Assad. So all these mean that the threat or the challenge, the common challenge at the military level is somehow revived, and that has led to military cooperation. Otherwise, as I said again, it's not going to necessarily spill over to economy and politics.
Fascinating story. There is the Turkish element. We will discuss that later in the panel. But before that, Diana, let me come back to you on the last point that you raised previously about the possibility of the Arab Gulf cooperation with Russia over their, as you said, you put it, on a more shared values. Would you mind if you discuss that a bit, elaborate a bit more, that what that means and how is probably going to impact interactions between Moscow and Tehran?
Thank you, Farzam. What I found very interesting and fascinating, every new wave of various recent crises, they caused Russia to turn forward away from the West towards the East. So what I mean by that, the idea to introduce, for example, Islamic banking and finance in the Russian Federation first arose during the financial crisis in 2008. And then these discussions began again after the annexation of Crimea in 2014. So, and from my field work as well, I found that the Gulf states become the kind of leading partners to develop this Islamic banking and finance developments with so-called Muslim Russia through different mechanisms, such as the group of the strategic vision Russia and the Muslim world, then there is a Kazan summit, also one of the kind of leading platforms for this economic developments with the Muslim world and Russia, and through the para-diplomatic efforts of Russian Muslim republics. And this work, for example, in terms of the Republic of Tatarstan is one of the leading kind of economic republics, and they try to develop this. And the key partners being Saudi Arabia through the Islamic Development Bank, and with Emiratis, for example, Dubai Economic Development Center also become very crucial in this efforts. And actually, even this year at Kazan Summit 2022, despite the sanctions, there were a lot of representatives from the Gulf states, and there were still the same discussions about the development, this kind of how Tatarstan call it halal lifestyle, which includes also halal tourism, banking, Islam, everything. So in one kind of concept. But what does it mean within the concept of Russia and Iran relations? From my point of view, because the Gulf states are kind of most economically rich countries, but at the same time, they are not under ongoing sanctions. So in a way, they are more appealing to Muslim Russia to develop relations in this regard. But at the same time, also in March 2022, the president of Tatarstan and ambassador of Iran in Russia, they discussed the potential for collaborations in these directions. So we might therefore expect some developments in this direction as well between Russian Muslim regions and Iran, but it will take some time before we see clear results. That's my answer to your question, Farzam.
Thank you, Diana. Interesting. I will get back to your point later in the panel. But before, Jacob, you are working on a very interesting project in NUPI on Russia's instrument of power in the Middle East. I'm interested to know how do you assess, I mean, with a look at the energy, of course, the Russia's possibility or instruments or tools, whatever you call it, to influence and impact of Middle East policy in broad terms, and when it comes with its relation to Iran. Of course, you tried to explain that, but I would like to go more in detail and exactly where Russia will lose and where Russia will probably have new things to maneuver.
Well, this issue of the so-called repertoires of power, meaning how various instruments of power are combined in order to achieve some strategic objectives, is a very interesting topic that needs to be studied in various historical and geographical contexts. And this project that you mentioned is called Trusmen, and this project deals with the issue of what kind of instruments of power Russia deploys in order to achieve its objectives in the Middle East. And I completely subscribe to the thesis that Hamid Reza launched in his statement that when you sit in Moscow and look at the Middle East, it's not necessarily about long-term strategic objectives. It's mostly about operational and tactical measures. And this could be illustrated, for instance, by the fact that, for instance, trade between Russia and Iran, that are one of the key Middle Eastern powers, is fairly limited. In 2019, Russia exported goods to Iran worth of $1.5 billion US, and Iranian exports to Russia represented like slightly more than $600 million US. So this is really almost nothing in kind of purely economic terms, but those relationships have some value in terms of achieving some geopolitical goals. And Russia is quite often described, especially when operating in the Middle East, as a kind of opportunist power that has been very skillful at filling some power niches that have emerged in the region. We know that Russia's decision to enter the war in Syria in 2015 was to a very large extent triggered by the lack of activity on the part of the United States, that somehow were very reluctant to get engaged in a new war in the Middle East. And Russia managed to present this intervention as something that was in line with international law, because the country was somehow invited by the Assad regime to provide support. So this is a very good example of this kind of opportunistic policy. On the other hand, we need to understand that Russia has both overlapping interests with the many Middle Eastern European countries and some conflicting interests. They compete for access and for market shares on global energy markets, but at the same time, they both are very much interested in finding ways of dealing with this threat of the kind of withdrawal from fossil fuels that is very much present on the European market, is going to be present also on the Asian market. So this is something that somehow make them work together. And then they, as major producers and exporters of energy, they have been working together on calming the markets. For instance, OPEC Plus is a very good example of this cooperation, where Russia works together with a number of Middle Eastern countries. And Middle East was also traditionally important for Russia as an area where Russia could supply its arms. So this is also an important dimension. But all in all, when we look at purely economic aspects, the Middle East is much less important for Russia than other directions, Europe and China. So this is to a certain extent an area in between. And when we look at Russian policies, we need to understand that there is a very clear hierarchy of goals, objectives Russia wants to achieve. On the top of this hierarchy is the issue of the security and stability of the current political regime, and having revenues generated by oil and gas trade is an important element here. So when you have to compete for market shares with other actors, you may somehow treat them as more competitors than ones that you need to cooperate. And then there is also this historical memory of the Middle East playing a sort of indirect role in making the whole Soviet project collapse. According to some newly found documents, there have been some cooperation on oil price between the United States and Saudi Arabia in the late 80s that have indirectly contributed to the collapse of the Soviet project. The Soviet project was no longer viable economically when the oil price reached was at the $20 US per barrel. So this was indirectly one of the reasons why the Soviet project collapsed. And those people in charge today in Russia treat this collapse of the Soviet Union as the major geopolitical catastrophe of the last century. So this is also something that makes them a little bit suspicious about what those, I quote, Arabs are going to do if they are somehow paid either politically or in money by the West, that Russia is treating as the main global challenger.
Interesting. Your picture, the way that you draw, it's very complex and evolving, actually, and we should wait and see how the dynamic moves. Hamid Reza,
if I may add, because this would also fit nicely with this the issue of identity that Diana has been discussing. We also understand that, according to some statements made quite recently by Lavrov and by the Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Iran and Argentina are thinking about joining this BRICS organization or group of countries. So this is also by joining BRICS, both Iran and Argentina will somehow also strengthen this kind of common identity that is to a very large extent based on this idea of putting an end to the kind of Western global hegemony, building a new world order where Russia, China are the leading powers, leading revisionist power, to put it that way.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. Well, I encourage all of our listeners and who are watching us also that actually drop your questions, please. I try to, of course, I see a number of questions in Q&A here in Zoom. So please, if you have questions, drop to the emails events@mei.edu. And in the meantime, I'm going to Hamid Reza to ask my last question to you, Hamid Reza. You know, the Israeli factor is quite a kind of important factor that is shaping the dynamics of Syria, and how Russia is positioning itself toward Israeli operations in Syria, which are usually aimed at countering Iran. How that is probably changing the dynamics of relation between Iran and Russia?
You know, to understand this Israeli factor and its impact on Iran-Russia relations, I think there are two major factors that we need to take into account, and the rest of the analysis should be built on these two. The first one is how long the Ukraine war is going to last, and of course the Russian kind of engagement there is going to last, and then if and how Israel position regarding the Ukraine crisis and its relations with Russia is going to change. So these two factors, I think, have the most important impact on the Iran-Israeli issue in Syria, because what we've seen over the past few years, actually since the start of the Russian active involvement in the Syrian crisis, has been that the Russians have always turned a blind eye on the Israeli attacks on Iranian and Iran-backed positions in Syria, of course, and then also, they have even refused from activating the S-300 or other air defense system in Syria to counter the Israelis in terms of defending their own ally, which is Bashar al-Assad. But now we've already started to see, and by the way, there has been a third element, of course, that in 2018 the Russians agreed with Israel to limit the presence of Iran in southern Syria to 80 kilometers from the Israeli borders. And we've seen changes in almost all of those elements. About this latter point, Iranian presence in the south, it had already started to change, I think, before the start of the Ukraine war, because over the past year or so, I've been following reports that Iran had started to kind of expand its reach towards the southern areas, whether it's been also a matter of coordination or something between the Iranians or the Russians. I'm not sure about that, but that had already happened. But a kind of risky situation that can, kind of that we may see even in the short term is that Iran may think that Russia's less active involvement on the ground may have already provided a ground for Iran, of course, to expand its influence in southern Syria, and to, of course, build a more stronger deterrence against Israel, and also use those areas as a potential launching area for an attack to Israel in the future. And that has already, I think, resulted in more frequent Israeli attacks against the Iranian positions. On the other hand, it seems that the Israelis have reached the conclusion that this so-called Russian obsession with Ukraine may have kind of made having a green light from Russia, as it used to be the case before, kind of irrelevant. So they can go ahead and even expand the scope and not only the quantity, but also the quality of their attacks, as we saw, for example, in the latest attack on the Damascus International Airport, which was unprecedented in terms of the scope and the damage that it did. So these are the factors that I think are already kind of pushing Iran and Israel towards further toward the confrontation in Syria. But then back to those main elements, I think if Russia's obsession or engagement with Ukraine doesn't last for long, and Russia starts to go back to the scene in Syria, that would somehow take the things back on the track as we used to see before the Ukraine crisis. But at the same time, we see that recently Russia has started to show a kind of stronger response, at least rhetorically, to the Israeli attacks, especially this latest one against the Damascus International Airport. I would interpret that as a kind of warning to Israel that we are still there, and kind of targeting the infrastructures of Syria would also harm our interests. So this is something that's not going to be tolerated. So I think what Russia is trying to do is to keep the level of tensions between Iran and Israel at the same level as it was before the Ukraine crisis. This is, I think, the shortest answer I could give.
Excellent, Hamid. So again, we should wait and see how developments lead us to the next stage. So Diana, you have the privilege of your concluding remarks as, let's say, at this part of our panel. As a last question to you, I'm so interested to know what the story at the end for Russia, at least until this stage. As all of us may agree that there are a lot of new things may happen in the next month. How the war actually is impacting Russia's foreign policy or approach toward the Middle East in general, and particularly in the Persian Gulf region. How Russia is evolving itself with the new dynamics that it has, its own international relation, its own resource deficit, if it has, which I guess it has, and so on. Please, Diana.
Thank you, Farzam. Before the Russia-Ukraine conflict, as most academic scholarship, they would put Russia's balancing act, how Russia was trying to balance relation with Gulf states, GCC states, Iran, Israel, Turkey, and with all actors, not just even the different groups within the kind of conflicts in different states. But for now, it's quite early to suggest Russia's emergence policies in the Middle East. But there are, as I see, two scenarios. Either Russia will continue this balancing act, and on the one hand, we could see the same dynamics in the Gulf region. For example, it's balancing relation with Iran, but at the same time, it has very strong still relation with the GCC states, especially given their, let's put in a way, neutral responses on the Russia's actions. But at the same time, also, there are some emerging policies of a zero-sum approach, which Soviet Union actually was following in the Middle East. So in that regard, we, as one of the kind of best examples of that, how Russia was supporting Palestinian cause during the Arab-Israel conflict. So in this, given these scenarios, also we are quite unsure about the Russia and Iranian relations, as we are discussing about some complexities. But at the same time, for example, other states, Russia and Qatar, how the relation will be developed, given that Qatar emerging one of the kind of alternative as energy supplier to Europe, and as well, I mean, Qatar was perceived as called as a non-major NATO ally before the crisis, and also this relation with Israel, how which shape they will take place. So there are a lot of questions rather than clear answers in this regard. But from my perspective and my view, how we have to measure Russia's policies in the Middle East, there would be everything based on national interest. So which would suits Russia, it will follow either zero-sum approach or kind of win-win approach. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. So we have some. We're actually at the end of our panel, but before we end, we have some questions coming from our audiences. I'm going to ask two of them because the rest somehow were answered during our discussion. One is for Hamid Reza, one for Jacob. Hamid Reza, for you, if you feel like go first. The role of Turkey in and Turkey's policies again in Syria, we're discussing on Russia-Iran relation. How you assess that? In just very short, in 1 or 2 minutes max. Thank you.
Actually, it takes another whole panel to discuss Iran, Turkey, and Syria. But to put it briefly, I think basically it's different how Turkey's involvement in Syria has been viewed by Iran and Russia. It's been different for them. But more recently, as speaking strictly about what's happening now on the ground, I can see a kind of convergence of the Iranian and Russian views towards Turkey's threats to launch a new military operation in northern Syria. Because in the beginning, when Turkey announced that the new operation is going to involve Manbij, Tel Rafat, and also areas east of the Euphrates, Russia was somehow comfortable with that. Not to mention that Russia was already in the most active phase of its Ukraine involvement, and having those areas within the scope of the new Turkish operation would mean that Turkey was going to, move toward the face of with the United States in Syria, and it happened at the same time, more or less at the same time as Turkey was kind of blocking the membership of Sweden and Finland in NATO. So that would be the best case scenario for Russia. That was the reason that Lavrov kind of expressed the most understanding, statements ever about Turkish operations. But then for Iran, it was, Turkey taking control over Tel Rafat would mean Turkey and Turkish-backed groups having also access to northern Aleppo and the Aleppo city and the gateway to central Syria, directly threatening Iran's position. So, but afterwards, as it became clear that Turkey is after a kind of deal with the United States, it dropped areas east of the Euphrates. It announced just Manbij and Tel Rafat. And then also it became clear that sooner or later there's going to be a deal over Sweden and Finland's membership, as it happened just yesterday. The Russian position also changed. So now we can see that the Russians are also even more strongly somehow than the Iranians are opposing the new operation. To what extent it would translate into an active kind of formation of forces against Turkey, that's a different story. But at least at the political level, they have a kind of common ground, it seems, in opposing the new Turkish operation in northern Syria.
Thank you, Hamid Reza. Jacob, one question for you, but before I pose it to you, I would like to all of our panelists prepare themselves for one quick question, 1 minute question at the end, and then we close panel. And that is the fact that how do you see the direction of Russia-Iran relation? Will you see the stronger, weaker, or the same situation of before the war? So we will go from Diana, Hamid Reza, and Jacob. But before that, Jacob, I would like to pose a question that comes from our audiences and says, what is the role of Iran in if the JCPOA probably comes back to the revival. In helping with the energy crisis, is Iran able to produce enough energy, and that how is probably going to change the relation with Russia at all, if has any impact on that?
Very important issue and very important question. I think that Iran can help Europe because it's mostly about Russia's energy relations with Europe and how they are going to be impacted by the war in two ways. One way is to somehow reach this agreement on nuclear issues and be able to produce more oil that could be supplied to Europe as a replacement for Russian oil. But Iran can also open its territory to some shipments of energy from other countries. Turkmenistan, for instance, is one of the major gas producers and has huge reserves of natural gas that the country is landlocked and has no access to other markets than the Chinese one. So this could also be an issue. And Kazakhstan has also embarked on building closer relationship with Iran. And one of the reasons is that Kazakhstan will most probably use the Iranian territory as an area for shipment of its oil and maybe gas to other markets. So this can make Iran not maybe the centerpiece of energy policy in the Middle East, but has some softening impact on the energy crisis that Europe is going to face because of those sanctions against the Russian oil and gas. So Iran has some work to do, and if they reach this agreement on nuclear issues, this could also open a kind of new chapter. We need to remember that before the sanctions were imposed on Iran, Iran was very active on the European energy market as well.
Thank you. Great, Jacob. Thanks. So, Diana, your concluding remarks, please. 1 minute.
Thank you. Thank you, Farzam. I just would like to say that it's quite a bit complex and early to evaluate the relations between Russia and Iran. But I strongly believe, along with this political, economical dynamics, shared identity factor will continue to play a very important role. And I just didn't have much time to stress on the kind of already the ideas, for example, how the parallels between the idea of the Russian Slavyanophiles idea and kind of Russian uniqueness, and how it should be not considered like develop in different path from the West. But at the same time, in Iran, there were also this kind of emerging ideas in 1960s with so-called West-exification position. And in this regard, I think since that time, historically, these shared identities, they kind of very played very important role kind of in terms of the similarities of both states. And especially now, as I see this conflict, it's not about really about Russia and Ukraine, it's more about Russia and the West. So, and also considering the very complex relation between Iran and the West as well, I see that future will be also shaped based on these identities. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your very interesting point, actually. Hamid Reza, please.
Generally speaking about Iran-Russia relations, I would use the phrase I used for my recent publications, business as usual. So based on the trends that we can see, it's not going to have a huge impact in terms of, kind of based on, of course, Iran's position regarding the Ukraine crisis, in terms of Iran or Russia deciding to reduce the level of their relationship, quite the opposite, at least at the political level. But when it comes to, the realities on the ground, what we can see is that, the same trends in terms of Russia trying to somehow play Iran and Arab countries off against each other. And also, as Diana said, prioritizing its own national interests, of course, in dealing with Middle Eastern countries, it would basically prevent the enhancement of Iran-Russia relations to a kind of strategic level. Because I can see that, today there's a lot of talk about this and that agreement discussed or signed between Iran and Russia. But, in the absence of balanced relationship between Iran and the West, and Iran and Russia, so Eastern and Western wings of its foreign policy being in balance, there's no kind of prospect for a kind of change in Iran's relations with Russia as well.
Excellent, Emreza. Thank you. Jacob, your turn, please.
Well, when we want to understand how the situation is going to develop, and it's not only about Iranian-Russian relations, we always have three alternatives. Business as usual, that Hamid Reza mentioned, is also sometimes called muddling through, meaning that the situation is not going to change very much, that we will see the same actors being involved in the same type of game. Then we can have a positive and a negative development. And to what extent something is negative and positive depends very much on the eyes that see, because positive development from Moscow perspective is not necessarily a positive development from the Western perspective. I think that at the current stage, the issue of reaching a deal on nuclear questions is one of the issues that will somehow define also Russia's relationship with Iran, because if the deal is reached, then Iran can play a more active role in helping the European Union deal with this energy crisis. If the deal is not reached, then Iran and Russia are going to remain the two most sanctioned countries in the world, and this will also have some impact on the relations, because being put in the same basket, they will also maybe try to strengthen their common approach to various sanctions-related issues. So this is my short answer to your interesting question.
Thank you. I'm so thankful to all of you that made this fascinating discussion possible. Probably I should say that what everyone agrees here is that the relation between Moscow and Tehran remains complex, uncertain, and depends on the ongoing situation in the coming months and probably years. I'm thankful again to all of you who patiently listened to us, and have a good rest of the day. Goodbye.